All right, welcome back, everybody. I'm going to take a look at Unit 9, the Golden Age of Asia. Our main focus here is obviously going to be China. One of the trends that you see pretty much all throughout Asian history is that in East Asia, China is politically, culturally, socially, and economically the, big kid on the block, for lack of a better term. So the majority of this is going to focus on China and its economic and cultural golden age. But we'll also talk a little bit about sinification, which is the influence that China has on its smaller neighbors, how it sets up this tribute system, which allows for cultural and political and economic diffusion out into the rest of East Asia. And then we'll also talk a little bit about Buddhism and how it diffuses throughout Asia, and some of its highs, some of its lows, the reaction to it as it moves through China. So to get a good, big picture look at this, we need to take a look at the Han Dynasty first. So the Han are the dynasty that establishes what is culturally, politically, and ethnically considered Chinese. Okay. They are the dynasty which establishes this idea of an eternal empire, of China being the middle kingdom, the center of all civilization. But like all dynasties, the Han do come to an end. The Yellow Turban Rebellion all throughout China challenges the Han and economically bankrupts them. The dynasty pretty much collapses under its own weight. And from this point on, China descends into a period of about 300 years of civil war. Now, this era of civil war is pretty challenging for Chinese culture and for the Chinese way of life that's established under the Han. The political, the social, the cultural unity and harmony that Confucius promised is basically just torn to pieces. Um, you know, Even with filial piety, even with people recognizing the relationships of superior and inferior, um, greed and corruption still wins out, and the Han are violently overthrown. There is, a state of pretty constant war throughout China for the next 3 centuries. And one of the side effects of this is that Confucius and his teachings are heavily discredited in China. People look at Confucius and his teachings and say, maybe filial piety, maybe obedience to superiors is maybe education is not the key to social harmony the way that Confucius says. And his teachings fall out of favor in many parts of China. And one of the things that this does culturally is this opens the door for Buddhism to grow and to spread and to increase in popularity. Now, politically, this period is known as the time of the Three Kingdoms, and China swings back and forth between smaller dynasties and kingdoms, none of which are able to completely unify the country. This also opens the door for China's, kind of historical enemy, the northern nomadic tribes, to expand into Chinese lands. They begin crossing the Great Wall. They begin conquering and settling in parts of northern China. They set up their own kingdoms on Chinese land. They begin adopting Chinese culture, agriculture, ways of dress, the Chinese language, etc. Now, as for the Civil War itself, as in the case of all wars, the war is incredibly destructive. The land suffers. Um, Agriculture and irrigation and cities are destroyed. Economic productivity takes a nosedive. but probably most importantly for China's economic success is the trade routes, especially the Silk Road, begin to dry up. A, because there is no state support. We talked about in the last unit how, or actually 2 units ago, how these trade routes exist on their own. They're not maintained or operated by any particular government, but they do flourish and they do see their most intense trade and the most economic exchange when there are strong states there to provide infrastructure, to provide security, to provide, the needs of these traveling merchants who move back and along the forum. So as China falls into this chaotic period, um, the trade routes start to dry up. There is little to no infrastructure. Cities are in ruins. There is very little security. Merchants feel like it's not safe to uh, travel into China. And so the trade starts to dry up. Now, through all of this, um, the one thing that offers some stability, that offers some comfort to the people of China is Maharana Buddhism. Now, you got to remember that Buddhism, after it leaves India, begins to syncretize with local customs. It begins to syncretize with other religious beliefs that it comes into contact with. And Maharana Buddhism is vastly different than Theravada Buddhism, which is the original form of Buddhism. Theravada is the one preached by the Buddha himself. Self-denial, meditation, destroy desire in order to attain nirvana. Maharana Buddhism focuses on enlightenment, but it also has elements of some of the other popular monotheistic religions like Christianity and Judaism, where the Buddha himself is now worshipped as a god. There are other gods, other Buddhas that are recognized in different forms of Maharana. Um, there's also the idea that you can, attain enlightenment and salvation through good works and good action. Um, there's also the belief in an afterlife that develops in some forms of Buddhism. So the Buddhism that makes its way into China is not the original form of Buddhism that we talked about in the classical era. So that's important to know because that form of Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, really wouldn't be very helpful during times of stress and chaotic times like what's going on in China during this era. So Buddhism in China during the time of the Three Kingdoms is more similar to Christianity than it is to the original form of Buddhism. And just like Christianity in the final years of the Roman Empire, Buddhism is one of the few things that offers hope and stability to the people of China. Now, this time of the Three Kingdoms eventually comes to an end. Chinese civilization and society, as we know and as we think about it, is eventually saved. Okay. And it is saved by a group known as the Sui, right? So the Sui are a dynasty that comes out of a smaller province in southern China, and they are able to defeat the rival factions in China and finally reunite the majority of what the Han had established hundreds of years earlier. Now, the thing to remember about the Sui is they come out of this warring states time of the Three Kingdoms period, which means that this is a militaristic dynasty. They are known for and they are accomplished warriors, and their goals are economic and militaristic expansion. They want to continue conquering. They want to build a large, powerful empire the same way the Han did. So After crushing their competition, they very quickly secure their northern border, push the nomads back behind the Great Wall, and they begin to focus on building the necessary pieces that were destroyed over the previous 300 years to manage a large, efficient empire. And in order to manage a large, efficient, bureaucratic empire, as we learned with the Romans and the Persians and others, you need infrastructure. And so the Sui set out to build massive amounts of infrastructure. First and foremost, they add 1,200 miles to the Grand Canal system that had been begun all the way back before the Han. And this is really important. And this is going to be part of what leads to the economic recovery that you see under the Tang and the Sung. So this canal system links northern and southern China, and that's a big deal because it increases economic productivity all over China. Southern China is more rural and more agricultural. It's the breadbasket of China. It's where the majority of food in China is produced. Now, generally, what happens is that food is then traded and it flows northward to northern China, which is more urban with larger cities, and it's more industrial, meaning that they manufacture more products there rather than growing food. And so what you get is this kind of relationship between North and South where, the South produces the majority of the food, trades it with the North in return for manufactured goods. Well, with an additional 1,200 miles added on to the Grand Canal system, goods can flow north and south more quickly, more efficiently, but more importantly for everybody else, they can move more cheaply from one region to another. And that's an important thing because food and goods being cheaper means that the Chinese people have more money in their pocket to invest in their businesses, to invest in luxury goods, to invest in building projects, to pay in taxes to the Sui. So economic productivity increases, wealth increases, the Chinese economy starts to make a pretty rapid recovery. Now, here's the other thing about the Sui is the Sui are not very popular, which you should be able to tell by the fact that their dynasty lasts only 29 years. The unpopularity of the Sui is primarily due to the fact that they use large amounts of forced labor in building the canal system in China. They also use large amounts of forced labor in the military, where entire towns of peasants are essentially drafted into the military and forced to fight, generally against their will. The Sui also create large tax increases so that they can pay for their massive building projects and their military expeditions. And I mean, you can look at the history of this country and realize people don't like high taxes, and they definitely don't like being told what to do, and they definitely don't like being forced into the military to fight on behalf of richer people who they feel like don't represent them. So obviously, a revolution, a rebellion is coming, and that's going to come in 618 CE. So when we come back, we'll talk about what happens after that rebellion and the establishment of the